Despite ample evidence and common sense, many people still align with Talmudic Judaism in believing that the day is reckoned from the evening. This, of course, is especially true in the Sabbath-keeping community. So today I'm going to respond to a challenge from a listener on the Sabbath-keeping issue with evening or morning. And we're going to examine the claims carefully to see what the Bible actually says on this very important issue. Welcome to the show, everyone. You're listening to the Dance of Life podcast, and I'm your host, as always, Tudor Alexander. I said previously that I would be making more response videos when the time came for it. Now that my library is done, and by the way, you can access that library in many different ways. You can check it out on the website ad-free. Of course, there's YouTube. You can buy a USB if you want to support me and have all the content, 1,000+ hours on your own without any internet connection. So there's many ways to do that now. Nevertheless, now that my library is done, I said that I would be composing more response videos. Not every week, but every so often when something important comes along and I can make a very edifying video on it, I will choose to respond to it. So that's what I'm going to do today because I received a pretty good comment, a good challenge. I disagree with it, but obviously it was a very good well-presented argument. So I'm like, this could be a good topic for a video and very edifying because there's very interesting arguments that are brought up. Now, I do read comments, and this is proof that I do. Now, I'm not going to make a habit out of answering every single comment that I get, obviously, and make a response video to it. However, when somebody works to put together an argument that is, cohesive and very well presented and very detailed and, importantly, and things that I haven't heard before, which I'm like, oh, that's interesting, that warrants extra attention, which is what we're doing today. So these arguments they present in this particular comment are very convincing at first, and it did edify me also researching these things and understanding how to refute them. So hopefully it'll edify you as well, because you might hear these arguments in the discussion on whether the day is reckoned from the morning or the evening. I'm sure a lot of people who keep the evening Sabbath are maybe familiar with these things, although personally I haven't heard it with anybody who believes in such things. So this is new, and so my goal is to offer this as an extra documentation on top of the already existing ample evidence in my Sabbath series, especially episode number 4, to help you edify and discuss it with others. It's really honestly hard for me to believe that people still think that the day is reckoned from the evening, which is just so backwards. It's literally backwards. But this is tradition. This is the delusion of tradition. This is the delusion of Satan's schemes in the last 2,000 years, corrupting knowledge and hiding the truth and all these things that we already know about. But this is philosophy. This is tradition. This is what you expect. It always does the opposite of the truth. It's just like cosmology. It's just like, thanatology. It's just like soteriology, and everything else. You don't need ample proofs, folks. You don't need ample proofs for these things. You just need to use your brain and to use your eyes. In some cases, like with cosmology, you don't need to be an astrophysicist. In fact, I would recommend against that because you're going to be indoctrinated. The more educated you are on these systems, the more indoctrinated you become, just like going to seminary. I'm glad I never went to seminary. But all you need to do is just go outside and take a look. What does it look like to you? Does it look like you live on a ball? No, you don't live on a ball. The earth is a plane. As to how it actually looks, who knows? I think it's probably an infinite plane that is supernaturally sustained by God, and continuity is procedurally generated by God's power. That's my working theory, because it's not a circle, so continuity must be supernatural. Nevertheless, that's another can of worms for my cosmology series. The point is, you don't need fancy equipment. You just have your eyes and your brain. Just look and see, and think. That's what you need to do. Most people don't do just that. Most people do not look. Most people do not think. They just regurgitate what they hear, and they're very confident about it. So common sense tells you that the earth is a plane. Common sense tells you that when you die, that's it. Common sense tells you that God, being self-existent and the creator of all things, is sovereign over all things, including the conscience. All of these things to me are common sense. They really are. But the tree of knowledge and philosophy is very seductive. And of course, it has many branches, and today we're going to be hopefully cutting off one more. But nevertheless, we're going to go over a very lengthy comment that this person put together. It's well put together. I will commend them on that. They put it together, and it definitely deserves a video response because it will be edifying for everybody. There's some good arguments, at least on the surface. It seems they're very well put together. But we're going to respond to it piece by piece. And our goal today is to see, as usual, what Scripture and history have to say on these issues. Now, with that, make sure you subscribe. Leave a comment of what you learned, hopefully something new today, because it was something new for me as well, because some of these I haven't heard before. If you want to support me, go to the website. Please stay in touch through the website. Join the email list for free. If you want to support me beyond that, then you can check out the store. You can hang out in the chat. You can be a paid member. You can donate. You can do whatever you feel called to do. If you have any questions about the Sabbath evening issue, if you need some timestamps of where I said something, the best person to ask is actually not me. It's Fennec. Fennec is my premier AI chatbot. He's super smart. He doesn't drift. He focuses only on my content, 1,000 plus hours and hundreds of questions, training material. He has learned everything that I've practically said. So he's a great resource for you, and he can help you find specific things that I've said. So very, very useful resource for paid members. It's only $5 a month, $50 a year. That's practically less than a coffee in this inflated economy. So if you want a full defense of this particular topic, which is the defense of the morning reckoning, then please see episode number 4 in my Sabbath series. Or again, ask Fennec. He can give you various defenses and timestamps and things. So this comment was on a video in my Adventism series where I discuss various errors and problems with Adventism. So all of you people who think I'm a Seventh-day Adventist or a Seventh-day Adventist in disguise, I'm not. Never was, never will be. But this is the video, Adventism, Ellen White, and Mystery Babylon, the evening Sabbath error. Of course, there's many errors in Adventism, unfortunately for them. But this is the video. It's part 7 of 10. And of course, one of the errors that Adventism has is the evening error, because Ellen White received a vision, among other things, from an angel of light, that told her that from evening to evening shall be your Sabbath, which is really just quoting Leviticus 23, but Ellen White interpreted it as that the angel was delivering a command from God that the true Sabbath is from evening to evening. So, of course, Ellen White, being a false prophet, being probably the greatest plagiarist of the 1800s, and I discuss all of that with ample evidence and proofs in the series, if you need it. But Ellen White was a false prophet. She was not hearing from God. She was not hearing from Jesus Christ. She definitely did not receive a visitation from an angel sent by God. She received visions. She received visitations for sure. But the question is, who was visiting her? And the deeper you dig into her own personal story, you realize that it was actually Satan masquerading as Jesus Christ that was visiting this individual. And she was extremely deluded. Never mind the fact that, again, she was a plagiarist. So there's ample evidence for all of these things. The 1800s was a time full of occult things. To this day, I believe she still has an obelisk over her tomb, or maybe they got rid of it by now. But a lot of shady stuff, a lot of weird things with the early pioneers in Adventism. I don't think Adventism is a cult. Some people say Adventism is a cult or whatever else. I don't think that's the case. Adventism is a denomination. They have several errors, obviously, but they're not a cult. The Adventists believe in the Trinity. They're, something like 90 million people or something on the earth. So there's a lot of, they're involved with like government contracts, their schools. So that's far beyond what a cult does. A cult is small. They're secluding people away from society. Two very different things. However, Adventism has many errors because of Ellen White. And so this is one of them, which is the evening Sabbath error. So Ellen White was a false prophet. And again, if you need proof of that, please watch the series. She most certainly did not hear from God. She most certainly did not hear from Jesus Christ. All of her teachings contradict Scripture in countless ways. And that, by definition, fails the test of the prophet in Deuteronomy 18. So, Nevertheless, millions consider her words as revelation from God, and millions yoke themselves to this stupid practice of reckoning the day from the evening and believing that everything starts at sundown, which is just absurd. So this is why this matters, because there's a lot of people who fall into this category. Knowing the truth about how the day is reckoned frees you from religious thinking and from tradition and from philosophy, because that's what this is. It is the tree of knowledge. It's not the tree of life. It's the opposite of the truth, because religion always does the opposite. Today, Sabbatarianism in general is plagued by legalists and legalistic ideas and concepts and the tree of knowledge. People like sacred name people, Torah keepers, Hebrew roots, Adventists, of course, the lunar Sabbath people, all of these people in the Sabbatarian community, the Sabbath-keeping community, there are countless Judaizing sects and legalistic-oriented sects. The Adventists will deny that they're legalists, which of course on paper they're not, because technically they profess salvation by grace, justification by faith. But anybody who's been in the Adventist world and come out of it can testify that just like with the Orthodox or whatever else, that what they say and what they do are completely mismatched. How it manifests is extremely legalistic, because Adventists, two reasons. Primary reason is that Adventists hold to a synergistic soteriology. Just like Hebrew roots, sacred name, Torah keepers, lunar Sabbath, all of these people are synergists. So what do you expect? It's a stone's throw away to join Rome in her way of doing things, even though all these people hate Rome and they're very aware of Rome. So that's the irony. But point number two, specifically for Adventists, is that they have the false prophet Ellen White. And Ellen White, if you study her life, she grew up as a Methodist. Now, Methodist 200 years ago was not waving a rainbow flag and chopping your penis off. Methodist 200 years ago was like the opposite of that. They were extremely obsessed with purity and sin and guilt and all this kind of stuff. So Ellen White was a very tormented soul, that she grew up in that situation, which of course translated into her theories like the investigative judgment and all of these other bogus ideas on salvation, which adds to the burden that already exists because of synergism. So how does that manifest? Well, it manifests in legalism. It manifests in legalistic tendencies, because they believe essentially that you must work to maintain your salvation. And especially in Adventism, you have to make sure you make the investigative judgment, because Jesus is looking through those books. He's got to double check and make sure you're going to actually be saved or not, which of course is so stupid. Gosh, it's stupid. And I have, like I said, I have hours upon hours of defenses against these things. So please don't call me an Adventist, because I'm not. But nevertheless, there are countless legalists and Judaizers and all kinds of things in the Sabbath-keeping community, which really frustrates me, because when you're coming into the truth about this important teaching, and it's going to be the hill to die on in the coming decade as these final situations play out. So learn the truth about the Sabbath, but learn how to walk the narrow road and not be swallowed by either Gnosticism and saying, oh, Jesus is my Sabbath, I can do whatever I want, or legalism, because on either side, there's death. That's why you have to walk the narrow road. So there's a lot of groups like these that are waiting to devour you if you do not have the right principles. And that's my goal in making this video. So that's our venture today. And I hope that this is going to be edifying to you and help you in your conversations and defenses. Now, let's read the first comment. This is zoomed in, so I have to go all the way down. There's so many little promotional videos here. Okay, so the user's name, I don't know if this is Mark Owusu, like O-W-U-S-U, or his name is Marco Wusu. So I'm just going to call him Mark. That's the easy way for me to call him. If that's not your name, Mark, and it's something else, then I apologize. But for the time being, I'm going to call you Mark. So he says the following, and this is broken up into 5 different arguments. So we're going to respond to all 5 in sections, and I'll put those in the timestamps. So first part, he says, here are a few reasons why I believe the sunset to sunset reckoning. This is not an attack on Tudor or a defense for SDA doctrines. Many people keep the Sabbath from sunset to sunset, but are not Seventh-day Adventists. True. Also, those who want to study more can check out a series from 119 Ministries called Time, Our Creator's Calendar. I think they have some useful information on this. Number 1. In Luke 13, verse 14, we see that the religious leaders were driving the people away from getting healed by Jesus on the Sabbath. They said the people could get healed on any of the 6 days in a week, but not on the Sabbath. This is a very important point to keep in mind. As already noted in Luke 4:16, Jesus was in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. If we move down to verse 38 of the same chapter, that is Luke 4, verse 38, we see that he left the synagogue that day and went to heal Peter's wife's mother. We have to remember this was still on the Sabbath day. If we pick the same story up in Matthew 8, verse 14 through 16, we realize that he healed many people in the evening of that day. In fact, Matthew 8:16 says, when the evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with the word and healed all the sick. Now the question is, why did the people wait until the evening to come to Jesus to get healed? It's because the religious leaders were preventing the people from getting healed on the Sabbath day, as they interpreted lifting the sick as carrying a burden, a move they understood as work. And he cites Jeremiah 17 and Nehemiah 13. Now, if the people waited until the evening to get healed, what does that mean? It means that a new day begins at evening. In the evening, a new day had begun, so it was okay for them to carry the sick, which is a burden, without contravening the Sabbath commandment. The same account can be read in Mark 1. If you take your time to read this, it is irrefragable because Jesus starts teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Verse 21, before healing Peter's wife's mother later that same day. If you factor in the idea that Pharisees were always against Jesus' healing people on the Sabbath, and there are several examples where they clash with Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, which I have already indicated in Luke 13, it makes sense that people would wait in their numbers until after the Sabbath to get healed. Now, pay attention, because this is very confidently presented, but you will notice that a lot of this relies on, it makes sense to me that this is how things are. Evening time is when the sun goes down, Deuteronomy 16. This is why Mark chapter 1, verse 32 says, and at even when the sun did set. Thus, at evening, when the sun goes down, a brand new day begins, and therefore people could be carried without the religious leaders accusing them of breaking the Sabbath. If a new day didn't begin at sundown, then I don't know why the people would be able to carry huge numbers of people on the Sabbath without attracting the fury of the religious leaders. Again, it's an assumption. And again, we have to reiterate that if the Jews were observing the Sabbath wrong, Jesus would not have gone along with them. However, as we have seen, he went along with the thing that was being observed by the people. Okay, so this is the first argument that Mark makes. And he connects two places together, mainly. He cited a lot of things, but mainly the connection is between Luke 4 and Luke 13. And the main problem here, Mark, is that you're assuming that your conclusion is correct, and you're going off of that, but you're not correct. So let's see what's going on, because there is a connection that you make that is not actually connected. In Luke 4 and Luke 13, there are both situations with the Sabbath. However, let's read Luke 13 first, 10 through 17. A woman with a disabling spirit. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your disability." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" As he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. So, what's an important note to make when you look at these verses? Well, the first important note to make is that there is absolutely zero mention of what time in the day this happened. We know that it was on the Sabbath day, but that's about it. It doesn't give any indication of when the healing was happening. Jesus was doing teaching and healing on Sabbaths all the time. So there's nothing to timestamp this event, and there's nothing to make it very specific in terms of timing. Mark, not Mark, Gospel Mark, but the writer, the author that composed this challenge, he assumes, based on Luke 4, that these events in Luke 13 must have been in the evening, because people waited until the evening to come because supposedly the Pharisees were stopping them from being healed and all of these things that are connected, but really they're actually not connected, Mark. They're really not. Hopefully you can learn something too from this particular presentation. Luke 4 actually proves the morning reckoning, and I will show you today. It doesn't prove the evening reckoning, because I've heard the argument from Luke 4 from other people too, like Adventists especially have used this argument, but it doesn't support your position at all. The scriptures don't support your position. The Talmud does, but the scriptures do not support your position. And I will show you Luke 4 actually does not support you at all. So Luke 4, verse 31 to 32, Jesus heals a man with an unclean demon. And he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath. And they were astonished at his teaching, for his word possessed authority. So what's the context? Well, a couple of points to keep in mind. Point number 1. Jesus came back after defeating Satan in the wilderness. So if you go back here into this chapter, this is Jesus begins his ministry, the temptation of Jesus. So this is right after that big event, after that big spiritual victory. And now he's beginning with power, and he's exceedingly active in teaching, healing, rebuking, doing all these things, right? Point number 2, the Bible does not document every single minute of every day that happened. Okay, it's not a chronology. It's a eyewitness testimony, and it's very easy to gloss over chronology when you're reading through these verses. In other words, like I talk about this in my Sabbath series also, but in the episode on the crucifixion and how the timing of the crucifixion proves that the Sabbath is reckoned from the morning. Because when you read through the events in Luke or Matthew or whatever else, you're reading like, okay, this happened, then what's his name? Not Josephus, because Josephus is the one we're talking about today. Joseph of Arimathea. You read about like his dealings with Pilate. He went to Pilate, then he went to the tomb, and these are just matter-of-fact statements. But you don't realize that, okay, like going to Pilate during Passover with all the traffic and setting an appointment, waiting to be seen by Pilate, the guy sending to double check on Jesus' body, then coming back, then going back to Jesus' body, taking it down, preparing the body, taking it to the tomb. You don't have a concept of how much time that takes. All of these things are just reported to you very matter of fact, but in between them, there are hours upon hours of activities. And so it's very easy to lose chronology when you're dealing with the Bible, in the sense like in the New Testament, these are just eyewitness testimonies of what they wrote down, not of everything that happened. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 in this context is that the text does not say the reason they came in the evening was because they were being prevented to work on the Sabbath by the Pharisees. It doesn't say that. This is an assumption by Mark, the author. In fact, every time the Pharisees are involved in trying to prevent Jesus, it is stated. The people were coming to Jesus, but the Pharisees said this, or the Pharisees approached him and said this. The Pharisees' objection and efforts are always mentioned because the text testifies against them as evil and their opposition. So there's a lot of, testimony about that. It doesn't say in this particular chapter in Luke 4 that the reason the people were waiting until the evening is because they were afraid of the Pharisees. It doesn't say that. It actually does not say that. That is a major assumption that you were leaning your entire argument on. So now, with these 3 points in mind, point number 1 is that Jesus is coming back with power and very active. Point number 2 is that the Bible does not document every single minute that happened. There's a lot of missing time, right? So you don't have a clear idea of what's going on all the time in terms of chronology. Point number 3, you are assuming that the reason the people came in the evening was because they were being prevented from working, but that's not the case. It doesn't say that at all. It doesn't say that at all. In fact, if you read in context, it reveals to you why they came in the evening. So, with these points in mind, we can explain easily and show how the Sabbath begins with the morning. Luke 4:16 says, "And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read." Now, really quick, before this, he's got the temptation event, and then he's in Galilee, he's going around, he goes to Nazareth. Okay, so Nazareth is his first stop. When he came to Nazareth, he read the scroll of Isaiah, which is the scene of him reading it, a lot of suspense. Everybody's watching him like a hawk. And then he sits down calmly and says, this has been fulfilled. Mic drop moment. And of course, this proceeds to enrage the crowd, and they try to take him to a cliff. They try to drive him off. It's not his time yet. So, he passes them by. The Bible says nothing about what time of the day that this happened with the event, with the cliff and the Sabbath, the reading and all this stuff. However, think about this very plainly, okay? So Nazareth was his first stop after the temptation event. He goes into the synagogue. They do the reading. The whole discussion ensues. They get enraged. They take him out to the cliff. They try to push him off and all this stuff, right? All that stuff happened. It doesn't tell you when that happened. We know it's on the Sabbath, but when during the day did it happen? We don't know yet. However, what is more common sense? What is more likely? Okay? You're dealing with a society that did not have LED lights, phones, flashlights, street lamps. They didn't have any of that, okay? When you go outside, you're going outside. It's dark. You need a torch. And even a torch is not that useful. You need lots of torches. You need a lot of light to create vision in the dark outside. So what is more likely? They were rallying during the daylight when they could see and pushing him towards the cliff, or they were rallying at night when they needed torches and they could barely see around themselves. Doesn't make sense. They were rallying during the day. It doesn't say that, but just common sense tells you that this likely happened during the day. However, we have a better proof for that moving forward into the later verses. Verse 31 says, "And he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath." So after the whole Nazareth situation, he goes down to Capernaum. Now, this is the point that I was trying to elucidate earlier. From verse 30, it says, "But passing through their midst, he went away." So this is in Nazareth. Okay, well, then suddenly verse 31 says, "And he went down to Capernaum." If you're just reading this, it feels like, oh, that just happened like literally the next moment. But you don't realize that Capernaum and Nazareth are like 100 kilometers apart. It's like a full day's walk, 12 hours. So there's a missing week here between these two verses, because this couldn't have still been on the Sabbath, because he was teaching them on the Sabbath again, right? The Nazareth situation where's the Nazareth situation? On the Sabbath day. The Nazareth situation was on the Sabbath day. Okay? Then, once he's done with that situation, he goes to Capernaum, and again, he's teaching them on the Sabbath. Well, that can't be the same Sabbath. They can't, because Capernaum and Galilee, and Nazareth are like 12 hours walk from each other. Even if you're walking really briskly, probably like 8 hours. So it's a full day's walk, meaning these two are not the same Sabbaths, meaning there's a week distance minimum. Let's say minimum 1 week, could be 2 weeks, could be 3 weeks. We really don't know, because this is just the next thing that's reported. So there's a minimum of at least a week between these two events. So if you read it, it doesn't matter what position you have with your Sabbath, whether you believe it's morning reckoning or evening reckoning, it doesn't work to read these chronologically. In other words, it doesn't work to read that this is the same Sabbath, because it doesn't make sense, because it's 12 hours later. So if you believe in the evening reckoning, then now he's teaching on the Sabbath and it's morning. It doesn't make sense. So there's a missing week minimum between these two events. And that's why Bible chronology is very tricky, and you have to think about, okay, what's happening between these verses? So there's a week of unreported time, and there are many activities between the two cities, which means, again, we have no explicit statement of what time of the day Jesus started teaching on the Sabbath in Capernaum. Same like with Nazareth, same like with Capernaum. We do not understand yet, although it's going to be very clear shortly what time of the day this happened. So we can infer, though, very easily from the ensuing context once he starts teaching in Capernaum. What we know is that the Sabbath had already come and he was doing his usual thing of teaching, healing, etc., etc. Okay, so as soon as he comes to Capernaum on the Sabbath, he was teaching. Okay, so then what happened? Well, a lot of things happened. In verse 37, he heals a man with a spirit, and it says, and reports about him went out into every place in the surrounding region. So he was in the synagogue, he was teaching, he was exorcising demons, he was working. And as a result of that, people obviously were amazed, and reports of him were spreading out throughout the entire region. Then he finishes, and he goes into Simon's house, and he heals his mother-in-law. That's verse 38 to 39. And he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Now Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they appealed to him on her behalf. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she rose and began to serve them. Now, really quick pause. Do you remember the difference between verse 30 and verse 31 with Nazareth and Capernaum? How there's a week of missing time, minimum a week of missing time between those two situations, minimum. Okay? Verse 37 is the last verse of the demoniac situation with the synagogue. Okay? Verse 38 is not necessarily like 5 minutes after that. This is just the next thing that's reported to you. Do you understand? So, verse 37 says that the reports about him went out into every place in the surrounding region. Then the next thing that you learn of is that he rose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. It doesn't tell you that immediately after he healed the demoniac, he then proceeded to Simon's house. So there's time here between these two verses that people don't account for. And this is the problem. Now, we know that people attended synagogue in that time for, on average, about 2 hours for the reading, for the fellowship, discussion, debate, whatever administrative things. So it's about 2 hours that people were doing these things. It's a reasonable estimate for all of the things that were going on, and especially if you add exorcising the demoniac to the situation, healing him, talking to him, reports going out, people asking Jesus questions, people tugging on his robe, whatever else, right? 2 hours is a very generous estimate, very conservative. Probably another hour to travel to Simon's house. Think about with all of the people surrounding Jesus, pulling him aside for conversations, pulling on his robe, blocking him. No, please heal me. Come to my house. It doesn't tell you all that. Remember, John's gospel says that if you were to write all the things that Jesus did, there would be not enough room in the world to write the books that were done, right? Of the acts that were done. So we don't have a concept of how much time passed. However, we know that in general, it probably took a few hours when he went to the synagogue, he was doing all these things, he was with the people there, and then he went to Simon's house and then healed his mother-in-law. So definitely a few hours. So a very conservative estimate is that Jesus was occupied at least a few hours from the time that the Sabbath had already began in Capernaum. Does that make sense? That's pretty easy to infer from all of the context presented. However, remember that the Bible does not report to you every single minute and hour that there is. But now you have a major problem, because in verse 40, it says, "Now when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them." Now that's a major problem, because the sun had set, yet the text already considered that day the Sabbath. Do you understand? Like, this entire series of events refutes the evening Sabbath. It does not support your position whatsoever. Jesus was healing and teaching on the Sabbath, going to synagogue, discussing, debating, doing the things that he normally does, which again, not all of them are reported to you. The key things are reported, but not every little detail is reported to you. And then, after several hours of doing all those things, which he normally did, now the sun started to set, and of course, What happened? Well, you had reports of him going out into the countryside. People were learning, and now people were starting to come and flock to him and say, hey, please heal me too. I heard you healed that demoniac. I want my son to be healed, that kind of stuff. So this makes it impossible for the Sabbath to be reckoned by the sunset, because the sunset is listed after several hours already had taken place on the Sabbath. Okay? In the very beginning of this section in Luke 4, when he arrives to Capernaum, on the Sabbath day, he begins doing his things. What is reported to you is synagogue, discussion, exorcisms, traveling to Simon's house, etc. So you just are given these details, but you don't have a concept of how much time it took. But we can safely assume several hours passed. And then the sun set. Well, then you're going to tell me that the Sabbath begins with the evening? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make absolutely zero sense. The assumption that Mark makes in this response, in this challenge, is that the reason people waited until the evening was because of the prohibition of the Pharisees with work. But do you see any of that in this text? Is there any clue that the Pharisees were involved in preventing people from coming to Jesus? Let me put it to you another way. Did that ever stop people from coming to Jesus? Even when the Pharisees were being legalistic? No, it didn't stop them before. People didn't wait. The news of Jesus spread like wildfire when he came to Capernaum. He went to the synagogue. He was doing his thing. He healed the demoniac. People were like, oh my gosh, wow, this is the Son of God. This is the Messiah. This is the prophet, whatever they thought at the time. And news started to spread throughout the countryside. And of course, within a few hours, by the time he got to Simon's house, they found out where he lived, found out where he was, and hordes of people started to ambush them and demand to be healed. That's what happened. They didn't wait to be healed because they were afraid of the Pharisees. How would they even know that Jesus was there? They didn't know about Jesus. They found out about Jesus because of his works. So the works that he did first are the reason that eventually people found out, and by the time the evening came, the sun was going down, the entire town knew about him and was marauding him to be healed. So they did not wait because of the Pharisees. They didn't wait. They didn't know about Jesus. That's the difference. They didn't know about Jesus until the news had gotten to their ears. So people didn't wait. Jesus was doing what he normally did. He went and did his synagogue. He went on the Sabbath. He was teaching, discussing, healing, etc. And the news spread after the demoniac incident. And of course, by the time the sun was going down, because again, people didn't have phones. They didn't have text messaging. Okay, they were running to each other's houses and telling stories. Of course, it's going to take several hours, and that matches the timeline that we see with the synagogue, with traveling to Simon's house, with, again, unreported time in between these events, which was very likely true. What about eating? Do you think they didn't eat lunch? I mean, these things aren't reported to you. They say, oh, Jesus had some falafel with some lamb, and, that took another 45 minutes. They didn't say that. They didn't say that, but that's in there. Okay, this is a full day. And then the sun came down, and by the time the sun came down, everybody and their mother found out about Jesus, and so they were, pulling on him and coming to him to get healed. Even Nicodemus, who was a high-ranking Pharisee, did not care about the Pharisees. He snuck in to talk to Jesus at night. So people didn't care about religion. When they had the possibility of truly being healed from their infirmities, and they saw that Jesus was the real deal, they didn't care about the Pharisees. They just came to Jesus. They weren't about to be like, oh no, the Pharisees are going to get us. Not when their life is at stake. Not when they could be healed of 18 years of infirmities. They didn't care. They wanted the supernatural. And so they weren't waiting for the Pharisees' permission. That's absurd. There's nowhere in view of that. They didn't know about Jesus, and it took several hours for news to spread to these people, and they finally caught up with him. That's what happened. And Jesus wasn't about to rebuke them like the Pharisees were rebuking them, because he's gracious. So he worked late into the evening, healing these people. So Luke 4 does not prove that the Sabbath starts in the evening. It actually proves that the Sabbath starts in the morning, because the Sabbath is listed to you first. And then there's a bunch of stuff that happened, hours upon hours of work and events, and then the sun was coming down and he was doing more healing. That's the correct chronology to understand these texts. not to read it and say the Sabbath and then, oh, the evening and then going back. Like, how do you even square that circle? You don't. You have to make several assumptions and assume that you're right and go based on your assumptions rather than just being honest with the text. The text is explicit that the Sabbath had already begun, and then there was hours and hours of time that were happening, and then Jesus basically was working late into the evening, not because the day starts in the evening, but because his fame spread like wildfire. What do you expect? Everywhere he went, people found out about it, and they were, piling on to get some of that supernatural healing in their life. Now, this also means, because Luke 4 unlocks the chronology correctly, very, very simply, if you just read in context. If we go back now to the other places, like Nazareth, that makes the most sense. The thing that was the common sense assumption, which is that they drove him out during the day where they could see where the heck they're going and not fall off the cliff, right? They drove him out during the day. That is supported by the interpretation of Luke 4. That makes sense. And then by connection, Luke 13 is also during the day, even though it's irrelevant to the situation. But it was during the day because these are all situations during the day. During at night, people were in their homes. They weren't out and about doing things. Are you kidding me? Like, where are these people? Like, you have to, this is such a frustrating situation because it's just so common sense, man. It's just so common sense. It really is. You have to think like, okay, do you think these people had like neon signs outside or they had Walmarts and stuff? No. As soon as the sun went down, you were like going inside. There's nothing to do outside. There's nothing to do outside. People woke up super early. Their lives were around the sun and the circadian rhythm of that whole entire process. They weren't meandering around outside, okay, at nighttime. I'm sure there were some people doing errands and stuff, but people didn't open their businesses at night or these types of things, okay? Everything was closed. So where do you think Jesus was going around at night healing people? Rather, he was during the day when people were congregating in different places in the synagogue or at the pools or whatever else. That's the thing that makes the most sense. At nighttime, nobody's out. So that's another strike for this whole interpretation. But even, here's another example that wasn't cited in this particular point, but here's another example that is the same exact thing that we're talking about, which is like common sense understanding. This is Matthew 12, 1 through 2. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." So the Pharisees are always around when they need to be, right? So the fact that the Pharisees are absent from Luke 4 tells you that they had nothing to do with people coming in the evening. People didn't know that Jesus was in Capernaum until they found out about him. That's why they came in the evening. So same thing with the previous situation in Luke 4 with Nazareth. What makes the most sense? They drove Jesus off a cliff, or not like close to off a cliff, but they were driving him towards the cliff at night with torches where they could barely see where their feet are planted, or they were driving him towards the cliff during the day because people were going to synagogue during the day. What makes the most sense? Same thing with this. He's in the grain fields with his disciples, Matthew 12. He's in the grain fields. They're walking around. His disciples are picking grain because they're hungry. This is so important if you just use your brain, okay? Think. His disciples were hungry, and the Pharisees saw it lurking somewhere, and they said, "Hey, it's not lawful for you to do that." Now, what makes the most sense? That they were nighttime walking around because the day was, basically beginning with the evening, and they were walking around in the evening, and the disciples were plucking grain because they're hungry to eat dinner, and the Pharisees were close enough to see them, and they're just lurking in the darkness in the fields. Or they're out during the day, they hadn't eaten lunch yet, so they're starving, which makes the most sense because at nighttime your body winds down. Generally, you're not as hungry at night, but in the morning you're super hungry, especially if you haven't eaten lunch. And the Pharisees don't need to be lurking in the grain fields because the sun's out. They can see you from far away. They can see what you're doing. What makes the most sense? What, just common sense. What makes the most sense? What makes the most sense? And of course, if you think logically, the thing that makes the most sense is that this was during the day. That means the Sabbath was considered during the day, not the evening. So anyway, think logically. Now, back to this. This is part 2. And in this part, he cites the Day of Atonement, which, of course, unfortunately, people still bring up as a proof text for the evening reckoning. But nevertheless, let's go through it. Number 2. The next point comes from Leviticus 23. I know Tudor has issues with this, but I want to make a point here. In Leviticus 23, verse 27, we read the following. Also on the 10th day of the 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. This shows that the Day of Atonement is on the 10th day. However, in verse 32 of the same chapter, still talking about the Day of Atonement, it reads, It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and ye shall afflict your souls in the 9th day of the month at even. From even to even shall ye celebrate your Sabbath. The question is, why does verse 27 says the Day of Atonement is on the 10th day, but verse 32 says it's on the 9th day? Because the 9th day at evening is the beginning of the 10th day, an indication that a biblical day starts in the evening. No, but anyway. Now, I know that Tudor doesn't accept this because he believes that this is specifically about the Day of Atonement and does not apply to the weekly Sabbath. He contends that God sometimes allowed some of the feast days to start in the evening. This is a plausible pushback. However, I disagree. This is because this argument is based on separating two things, weekly and annual Sabbaths, that Second Temple Judaism did not separate. In Jewish thought, annual Sabbaths and weekly Sabbaths did not have different day boundaries. It's not true. They differed in occasion, but not in timekeeping mechanics, and I feel that once a culture defines what a day is, all commanded days use that same definition unless a text explicitly says otherwise. Again, the basis is what? I feel that this is the answer. The reason why I don't think this explanation works is because if annual feast Sabbaths used sunset boundaries or reckoning and weekly Sabbaths used sunrise or morning reckoning as Tudor alleges, then what happens when they coincide? This would lead to two different Sabbaths with different starting times on the same date in the same city and regulated by the same temple authorities. This is administratively and historically impossible, a recipe for confusion. Besides, I do not think there is evidence of any Jewish sect, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, keeping two different clocks for Sabbaths, as this would have been sectarian chaos, and we see no trace of such disputes. So, there are two main arguments in this particular section. The first argument is that the text says in Leviticus 23 that the Day of Atonement is on the 10th day, but the preparation begins on the 9th day at evening. So there seems to be an inconsistency there. The second argument is that the Jews or the Israelites did not distinguish between weekly Sabbaths and annual Sabbaths. In other words, the cosmological Sabbath, anchored to creation, and the ceremonial feasts that had their various times about when they begin and so on. He's arguing that there's no such distinction between these things, that they would fall on, they would be reckoned from the same starting point, which of course would be the evening in his particular view. However, both of these arguments have very simple responses. We will start with the second one about the distinction between these two, the annual and the cosmological Sabbaths. We're going to start with the second one because that's going to help explain the first. So, point number one in response to this is that there is an equivocation here on this particular issue that the Jews didn't distinguish between weekly Sabbath or annual Sabbath. But there are distinctions in two prominent ways. Number one, the weekly Sabbath is a moral command, and it's part of the Ten Commandments, which were placed inside of the ark, and the book of Moses was placed outside of the ark. So if God is making the distinction between the ceremonial law and the eternal moral precepts, then that is a distinction made by the text explicitly. Point number two, the weekly Sabbath is tied to creation. It goes back all the way to the first week of time. It goes back to the beginning. It is before any covenant. It is before anything. It's the creation foundation. Therefore, it is reckoned according to a specific pattern that God laid down in Genesis. Of course, people who read the evening Sabbath go back to Genesis and say, see, it says there was evening and there was morning the first day. Therefore, evening begins the first day. No, it does not. please watch my Sabbath series. Again, episode number 4, to get a very handy-dandy visual breakdown of what it's actually saying. Genesis 1 is a chronology, meaning everything is reported to you in sequence. That's why the word "and" is used, because "and" tells you the thing that comes after the previous thing. When it says, "and there was evening, and there was morning," how do you know the order of those events? Well, because morning is listed after evening. Okay, well, what is evening listed after? You ever think of that? Most people don't. They read that as a recapitulation. They don't understand that the text is a chronology. Excuse me. The text is a chronology. In other words, God is doing stuff. He's creating. And there was evening. Then morning came, which did what? It ended the previous day and it begins the new day. What happens in the morning? Well, there's more creation activities. Very simple. Evening comes after the creation activities. As an evening Sabbath Judaizer, you read Genesis 1 and you say, God was creating the heavens and the earth, etc., etc., etc. So that took time, obviously. Nothing is difficult for God, but that took time. There was a time that elapsed because we're working in time and space now. And then you go back to the beginning and you say, oh, that there was evening when that happened. That's not how you read it. God was doing stuff, then there was evening, then there was morning again. In parentheses, again. Morning came after evening, and evening came after morning, when God was creating during the morning, during the light. Let there be light. That was the beginning. So this is nonsense. So Genesis 1 anchors the Sabbath in a morning reckoning. But regardless, the Sabbath is a moral command and is distinguished from the ceremonial commands by the text itself. The second point is that the Sabbath is also tied to creation. And therefore, it's reckoned according to the pattern that God laid down in Genesis 1, which is working in the morning, and the day begins with the morning and ends with the morning. The holiday Sabbaths themselves came after creation, thousands of years later, and they were tied to commands and historical events that were temporary and typological. Paul makes this distinction as well. He says that there's a difference between the promise and the law. The law came after the promise because a promise has to be believed, not obeyed. The law came and it was a temporary situation after the promise. It's the promise that gets you grafted in and saved, not the law. So the law was a temporary situation designed to set apart Israel, to typify the Messiah, etc., etc. Meaning that the commands that came with that particular law, again, ceremonial law, not moral law, the commands that came with that particular set of laws are not anchored in creation. They are anchored in a different pattern. They're anchored in the pattern of the Exodus, in the wilderness and everything else that the Israelites were experiencing, which again pointed to Jesus, the plan of salvation, etc., etc. These things were temporary situations that were designed to point to a more full truth. So you cannot compare annual Sabbaths, feast days, whatever, with the cosmological Sabbath. You can't, because they were established at different times, for different reasons, under different reckoning, under different patterns. The cosmological Sabbath is eternal. It's part of the moral character of God. It is the foundation of time itself. The ceremonial feasts and Sabbaths have been done away with. There's no more feast keeping. You can't even calculate the feast properly, as they were given to the Israelites in the very beginning. The weekly Sabbath was blessed in the very beginning, and it set the foundation for the 7-day week. The ceremonial Sabbaths do not have that same level of blessing. They are completely different. They're two completely different systems. So to say that they are reckoned in the same way and that there's no distinction made by the text, I'm not sure that you are reading the Bible that everybody else is reading, to put it plainly. Another thing to consider is that the Mosaic Sabbaths were commanded later and only for a temporary purpose, so therefore they were not designed to structure time for all of mankind. Again, the purpose is very different. The cosmological Sabbath is designed to structure time and history forever, because forever you will understand that the seventh day relates to the plan of salvation. I've talked about that quite a bit in my Sabbath series. fact, even the last episode of my salvation series, we talk about that quite a bit. So make sure you understand the precious connection between the Sabbath and the gospel. Very, very precious connection. That's why the Sabbath will be the defining issue of our age, because it is a physical representation of the gospel. And people will deny the gospel and therefore will be destroyed. Nevertheless, that's a can of worms. The point is that they are two different things for two different purposes. The annual Sabbaths of the ceremonial Mosaic covenant were not made to structure time for all of mankind. They were not made to be observed by all of mankind. They were circumstantial and temporary. Therefore, they have different reckonings because they are tied to different circumstances. And again, in this particular case, things like the Exodus, separating Israel from the other nations, the coming of the Messiah, etc. Therefore, the Mosaic Sabbaths, the ceremonial Sabbaths, these things are circumstantial. They're not universal. The cosmological Sabbath is universal because it structures time for all of mankind. Does that mean that all of mankind keeps the Sabbath? No, obviously not. But it structures time, and you can watch my video on how Saturday is the Sabbath, how God has preserved the 7-day sequence of time from the very beginning. It's truly profound. How despite all of the shenanigans of the devil and all of the times and laws being changed, the 7-day sequence has been uninterrupted. Very, very profound thought. But that is very different than the feast days which have gone away and you can't even calculate anymore. You cannot even calculate them. Now, Mark said in his rebuttal that, quote, I feel that once a culture defines what a day is, all command days use that same definition unless a text explicitly says otherwise. Okay, first off, Mark, a culture does not define what time is or how a day is defined. A culture doesn't define that. God defines what the day is. So I don't care what a culture says, I care what God actually says. And when we look in the scriptures, we consistently see that God defines everything with the light, because God is light. Furthermore, important for you to understand, and for everybody watching this presentation, is that Judaism, after Jesus especially, became increasingly divergent from the Levitical tradition of Moses. Increasingly divergent. They rejected Jesus, they rejected the Messiah, which was the thousands of years of fulfillment of the scriptures. So strike 1, 2, 3, right? But on top of that, they added to their blasphemies with all sorts of nonsense. Modern Judaism today, I've talked about this plenty of times, but modern Judaism has nothing to do with the Old Testament. It's really a lot like Catholicism in the early church, in the New Testament church in Acts, in the book of Acts. Same thing. There's no connection, even though both of these systems respectively will fight tooth and nail to convince you that they go back all the way to the very beginning. But Judaism has a completely different view of the Messiah, of the plurality of God. They believe they're Unitarians, basically, of salvation. They're synergistic instead of monergistic, as the Israelites were, like David or Solomon or the apostles. They believe in Kabbalah, the extra-biblical revelation. They do all sorts of things with gematria, and they have a completely counterfeit alphabet. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They have nothing to do with the Old Testament. So when you cite, like Judaism or whatever else, cultures, when you're going and searching for how people believed like 2,000 years ago, you have to be very careful that you're not sipping on poison from Masoretic, rabbinic, Talmudic commentary. Because the rabbis have done a number on history and obfuscating the truth when it comes to these things. So you have to be very careful and not be seduced by anything that's Jewish. It is important to understand cultural context, cultural history, anthropology. It's important to understand these things. But you have to be able to sift away the things that are not good. And a lot of that has to do with all of the stuff that came after Jesus with Judaism. This is why a major obstacle when learning about these things is that people rely on Talmudic and rabbinic commentary or traditions, and of course they get deceived as a result. But even with the evening reckoned holidays, you can see some important clues. So let's look at those evening reckoned Sabbaths and see what we can find. Exodus 12, verse 1 through 10, the Passover. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." Now the word here is Chodesh, and I have a whole 6-hour episode on the true calendar. Chodesh is not a new moon. This is a sun station. This is a period of time when the sun is in a particular constellation. And because the Exodus happened around the equinox, which is what Josephus tells us, which is also consistent with everything else. Abib is when the barley sprouts, starts to ripen, whatever else. Life is beginning. God begins with life. The true year, according to God, is when the spring happens. That's why Jesus died and resurrected in the spring. That's why the Exodus was in the spring equinox, because that's when the light starts coming into the world. What do you think happened in the very beginning? Did God create in the winter, or did he create in the spring? What do you think is the most likely answer, given all these patterns? Very likely he created in the spring, with life entering into the world, light entering in the world. So the Chodesh is the sun station of the very beginning, around, like I said, the equinox at that time. And that's the beginning, meaning God starts with life and light. Important clue. Verse 3, "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn." Now, why do you think the morning is used as the cutoff time? Anyway, the Passover, actually the first Passover was on the Sabbath. I talk about that in my, one of those episodes in the Sabbath series. I think it was in the last decade, I think I talk about it. But the point is this, that the first Passover was on the Sabbath because it was the final judgment on Egypt, and yet it was also rest for the people of God. And it's interesting that Jesus was slain on a Passover, which was the 6th day by the time it was AD 31, so that he could rest on the Sabbath. So you see how God paints these pictures. He's very particular about time. So we have to be very particular when we read these things and make sure we don't invert what God is doing. So the Passover reckoning begins in the evening. But why? Why does the Passover reckoning begin in the evening? Is that because when the day begins is when the day is reckoned, or is there something else? The answer, of course, is no. It's because it's a reenactment of the Exodus. The final plague on Egypt was the Passover, where the firstborn were taken. And again, that happened on the Sabbath. It was the 4th Sabbath, actually, by my reckoning of the Egyptian judgments. So there were 4 Sabbaths, boom, 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 boom. And the 4th one, that was the final judgment. So they rested in their homes while the enemy was being destroyed, very typological of the final judgment also. And then they began the Exodus by the morning, on the first day, in the fulfillment of the new beginning. So God structured everything on that Sabbath to where they were resting while the angel of death was going around and taking lives. And late into the night, they plundered the Egyptians, they got everybody ready, and they left so that they could begin the Exodus in the morning, on the first day of the week, in fulfillment of the creation typology, which is pointing also at that time to the future resurrection, the first day, the new creation. All these things are all in alignment. Do you understand? Jesus resurrected in the morning, right in the morning. Who knows exactly when, but he resurrected in the first day, in the very beginning and fulfillment of the creation typology, Exodus typology, etc., etc. So God gave them a new beginning with the first day of the week. Everything was timed perfectly. And this is why the Passover has to be eaten by morning, because the day begins in the morning. You are reenacting the final Sabbath that Egypt was judged on. And that Sabbath ended in the morning. So don't leave it until the morning, because the morning is already now the new creation, the new beginning. So don't, what's the word I'm looking for? Don't fail to finish the job, right? Don't endure to the end, in a sense, right? When you eat something, there's a relationship here. What I'm trying to say is this. There's a relationship here that you can see typologically between even the new covenant, right? When the Bible tells you, especially in the New Testament, endure to the end, endure to the end. The one who endures will be saved, right? You have to finish your course. Does that make sense? Well, the same thing is with the Passover. The Exodus beginning on the first day of the week, that's the new beginning. That's a picture of eternity, the new journey with God. Do not leave any of it till the morning. Finish your course. Does that make sense? So the morning is when the day began. That's why it was cut off by the morning. It was reckoned in the evening because it was reenacting the Exodus, but that doesn't mean the day begins in the evening, my friends. Now, let's move on to verse 17 through 18 with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to be keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread today. This is an idiomatic language that really just means you shall observe this feast perpetually, not literally forever, even after Jesus comes, because the whole point of Jesus coming is to fulfill these things. Nevertheless, verse 18, in the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. Okay, so there's a particular reckoning. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is reckoned by the evening. But again, you have two important things. The text tells you the 14th day of the month at evening. Now, why would you specify at evening if everybody understood that the day began in the evening? Why would you specify that? Doesn't make any sense. Unless, of course, the day doesn't begin in the evening and you need to specify when in that day you are needing to start this behavior and obey this command. So that's point number one. Notice, point number two also, that the circumstance that authorizes this particular command and special reckoning has to do with the circumstance of the Exodus. You are repeating a pattern. You're putting into memory something that God did that you need to remember so that when the Messiah comes, you don't reject him, which of course they still did. But nevertheless, the point is you need to put this in your memory, cultural memory. So this is a circumstantial thing for Israel. Yet there are many things that are reckoned by the morning that we can see in the Old Testament using these simple texts, like the first 5 books. Leviticus 6, verse 9. Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth on the altar all night until the morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. Why is the morning the cutoff date? Because morning is when the new day begins, my friends. Very simple. Leviticus 7, verse 15. And the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for the thanksgiving shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it until the morning. So the burnt offering, the peace offerings. Now going back to Exodus, when they were released from Egypt and God was giving them the new life and putting them back on the true calendar, giving them chronology correctly, we need to examine what happened there because it's very telling. Exodus 16, verse 16 through 27. This is the manna incident. This is what Yahweh has commanded. This is the command for the manna. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over until the morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, it doesn't say evening by evening, it says morning by morning, they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. Now, really quick point. On the 6th day, when does the 6th day begin? Well, it tells you in the previous verse, morning by morning they gathered it. So on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, in parentheses, in the morning. And when all of the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, This is what Yahweh has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. Why? Because that's when the day begins. So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field." So when the morning came, right, what can we deduce? This time, because God had provided for them for 2 days, he supernaturally preserved the manna, and it did not stink, it did not go bad. So this was the morning. They found out in the morning that, hey, this manna is doing well, it's preserved. Moses said in the morning, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh." Well, when is he saying this particular command? He's saying it in the morning, because they woke up in the morning and they saw that the manna was preserved, and Moses said, "Eat it today, go ahead, it's good, because today is the Sabbath, is the day of rest. It's the Sabbath to the Lord." So that means the Sabbath was already reckoned, because he's saying today with the morning. Do you see how plain this is, my friends? 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. And on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And of course, God rebukes them for this. But on the seventh day, how is that measured? When did they go out to gather? Do you go out to gather in the evening? I mean, do you go out with your torch and you're looking for grass? Or do you go out in the morning, as it says previously, morning by morning, they were gathering it. Then on the seventh day, the morning came, and Moses said, "Today's the Sabbath. You can eat it." And then some people went and gathered on the seventh day, and they were rebuked for it. Well, when were they going to gather? Were they going to gather in the evening? Come on, folks. It's really so plain. I can't believe people still have trouble with this. But this is the blindness of philosophy. This is the blindness of tradition. This is the blindness of your own feelings, and you're not reading in context. So plain. So Leviticus shows you that there are sacrifices and feasts and things that were counted by the morning. Exodus shows you that before any of these things even happened, the Sabbath was still reckoned according to the morning. So when God put them on the right calendar with the beginning of the year in the spring, and how to reckon things appropriately so they could be aligned with the clock of life, he also reminded them of the Sabbath, which, by the way, the Sabbath was reminded to the Israelites before Mount Sinai, before the covenant with Moses, which shows you there's yet another distinction that God is making between the temporary ceremonial system and the eternal moral command. They are reckoned completely differently. And how is the Sabbath reckoned? Well, it's pretty obvious from Exodus 16 that the Sabbath is reckoned from the morning. Very clearly so. You cannot possibly read evening reckoning into these verses. And if that's true, then what you're dealing with is something more nuanced, as usual. So, conclusion, the argument that there is no distinction between the weekly Sabbath, or the cosmological Sabbath, and the ceremonial Sabbaths fails miserably. I'm sorry, Mark, it just fails. The text itself explicitly delineates between the Sabbath as a moral command and the annual Sabbaths as special holidays with, special circumstantial reckoning and typological reckoning that was all designed for a temporary purpose. The annual Sabbaths are anchored in a different kind of reckoning because they are tied to something temporary and typological. The cosmological Sabbath is anchored into the pattern that God created in the very beginning to structure time itself for humanity. And of course, people still invert that time because they listen to their own emotions, but the truth is the truth. The text also delineates between the Sabbath as an eternal thing and the Mosaic law as passing away. The text also shows clearly that some things were reckoned from the morning as expected, while others, like the Day of Atonement, the Passover, the unleavened bread, etc., were reckoned with the evening as special times that were layered on top of the cosmological time. That doesn't mean confusion, my friends. It just means that they're anchored in something other than creation. They are anchored in the pattern of the Exodus that God set for them. Ancient Israelites understood that there was a difference between the natural day and the commanded holidays. because they pointed to historic events like the Exodus. But even the historic events themselves, my friends, prove to you that the day is reckoned by the morning. How God started the Exodus on the first day of the week in the morning, how he reminded them of the Sabbath in the morning with the manna before Mount Sinai, etc., etc. The Exodus itself, which is the anchor for all of these ceremonial laws that came later, who have reckonings in the evening and things that seem confusing, the pattern that they are based on, if you actually analyze the Exodus itself, you realize that God is doing everything by the morning. In fact, even the plagues themselves. Go watch my last decade episode where we look at the plagues in Egypt. It's always in the morning for the most part. In the morning, if you don't repent, Pharaoh, then in the morning, the plague is going to come. Why in the morning? Because the morning is when the day began. And the morning is the thing that delineates everything because it's light. God is light. God begins with light. Now, point number 2, this brings us to the second part of this argument, which is that it says to start the Day of Atonement on the 9th day. The text says that the Day of Atonement starts on the 9th day with the preparation in the evening. However, the Day of Atonement itself is on the 10th day of the month. So what's going on there? The author of this comment says that, therefore, the day is reckoned by the evening. But you're really just conflating two things because, again, you're assuming your conclusion is correct and you build on it. So that's the problem. We have just shown very clearly that there's a difference between the natural day and ceremonial days, that the text itself clearly delineates. Therefore, what Leviticus is telling you is that the preparation for the Day of Atonement starts on the 9th day at the evening. The Day of Atonement itself is on the 10th day of the month. And that preparation is layered on top of that, and it's offset by some time. So it begins on the 9th day in the evening, and it goes to the 10th day in the evening. But the 10th day is when the Day of Atonement happens. It's when the Day of Atonement is reckoned, because the day itself, the days of the month are reckoned with the morning. Because there were other things going on during that day, like prayers, sacrifices, whatever else. They're going on, rituals, various getting together, fellowship, all that kind of stuff was going on. So the Sabbath rest period, or the sacred time that God is outlining for these people, is from the 9th day in the evening to the 10th day of the evening. That's a special time of solemnity, of rest, of paying attention. But the days themselves are reckoned from the morning. They're reckoned from the morning. It doesn't even make sense to say that the day is reckoned from the evening, because then how are you getting 9th and 10th day in the first place? Do you get it? How are you getting the 9th and 10th day in the first place? If it goes from the 9th day, let's put it this way, because this gets confusing quickly. If we go with Mark's assumption that the 9th day in the evening is actually when the day is reckoned, then the evening of the 9th day to the 10th day would be the 9th day. The 10th day would be counted the day after that. Do you get it? Because they count it inclusively. It doesn't even make sense. The reason that you have this labeling of the evening on the 9th day to the evening of the 10th day is because you have two reckoning systems working simultaneously. If they were in agreement and everything was reckoned with the evening, then you wouldn't have that distinction. You would just say on the evening of the 10th day or the evening of the 9th day. That would be the Day of Atonement. The entire thing would be on the day. The entire Day of Atonement would be from the evening to the evening. But you don't have that. You have the Day of Atonement is on the 10th day. Well, how is the 10th day reckoned? It's not reckoned by the evening. It's reckoned by the morning. And then you have a parallel period that begins on the 9th day at the evening of that day and goes into the 10th day in the evening. So you have two parallel periods. Hopefully that makes sense. Nevertheless, you have two parallel times, a natural time, which is anchored in creation and cosmology, and you have the ceremonial time that God is outlining specifically and is circumstantial to Israel and to the Exodus and to typify the Messiah and all of these things. So therefore, as I have said a million times, stop using Leviticus to try to prove the evening Sabbath. Leviticus 23 especially is about the Day of Atonement. That is a ceremonial, sacred time that is layered on top of the cosmological time that is proceeding day by day. And remember, people count it inclusively. So if you want to try to align these two things and say that every day begins in the evening because the Day of Atonement begins on the 9th day in the evening, then you wouldn't have the distinctions of the 10th and the 9th day. You would just have one day that all of that was happening on. Doesn't make sense to reckon it the way that it's reckoning unless you have two parallel systems. So don't use don't use Leviticus 23 to prove the Sabbath evening. Don't use anything. Just don't believe in the Sabbath evening because it's wrong. It's incorrect. The Israelites were not stupid, my friends. They were watching the skies. They were very intelligent with astronomy, astrology. People back then watched the heavens all day long. They understood that there were many layers to time, and they had a complex system of timekeeping with multiple layers, especially for all of their rituals and things that they were doing. They understood these things. They weren't stupid people. They were watching the skies nonstop. There was a natural day which was set forth in creation by God, and then there were added times on top of that natural pattern because of the historical and typological circumstances that needed to play out both through the Exodus and then eventually, obviously, to Jesus Christ. So do not confuse the two because the text certainly doesn't. Now, part 3, this next one argues history using Josephus, which at first seems very convincing and which really, these are the arguments that really motivated me to make this video. So point number 3, he says, the next reason why I believe the Sabbath follows a sunset to sunset reckoning is history. Josephus is a trusted historian who was very close to being a contemporary of Jesus, albeit a bit younger. He was born a few years after Jesus' crucifixion, and although he did not personally witness Jesus' ministry or death, he lived within the same generation and cultural zeitgeist. As a Jew himself, he understood Jewish worship practices and wrote about it. The fact that he lived around that time makes his account more credible compared to someone who lived hundreds or thousands of years after Jesus walked the earth. True, Josephus is a valuable historical resource. In Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 5-82, Josephus writes the following, quote, "And the last was erected above the top of the Pastophoria, where one of the priests stood, of course, and gave a signal beforehand with a trumpet at the beginning of every 7th day, in the evening twilight, as also at the evening when the day was finished, as giving notice to the people when they were to stop work and when they were to go to work again." This is a clear indication that a priest signaled the beginning of the Sabbath, 7th day, by blowing a trumpet at the evening during the Second Temple period, and also signaled the end of the Sabbath the next evening. That is, from evening to evening. Do we have any extra biblical evidence of how the people of God kept the Sabbath from sunrise to morning times? I don't know, but I am yet to see that in my research. As I have already indicated, this was the prevailing practice during the time of Jesus, and if the Jews were keeping it wrong, he wouldn't have kept it with them as he was sinless. Again, now we're entering the assumption territory, which you will see, Mark, hopefully this presentation will open your eyes that you have made some very grievous assumptions. When they added man-made rules to the observance of the Sabbath, he rebuked them, and so if they were keeping it at the wrong times, we would certainly have confirmation in the Gospels. Yet we see that there was no disagreement in the timing of the Sabbath in the Gospels. His custom was to go to the synagogue every Sabbath and worship with the people. For me, that point shuts everything down because if they were keeping it at the wrong times, he wouldn't have joined them in the synagogue every Sabbath. Josephus is solid evidence that the Jews kept the Sabbath from evening to evening during the time of Jesus, and that is exactly what he did as well. I know that man-made traditions may be wrong, but if it's the tradition that the Savior himself kept, then I do not see any problems there. Well, the problem, Mark, is that you've already assumed that your conclusion is correct. You've also assumed that when you read an English translation of anything from antiquity, especially Greek, that the translation is accurate. And then you've built an entire case on that, but your case falls apart very easily if you actually just do a little bit more research and you realize that all these things are wrong. So far, we've done quite a bit just using scripture alone to show you that the evening reckoning is wrong. But nevertheless, it's important to also consult history because this is a very seemingly convincing argument. Very seemingly convincing argument. It's like, oh my, do I have this wrong? Was there something else going on? So basically, what's the claim? The claim is that Josephus is outright stating that the Sabbath begins in the evening. Because Josephus lived around the time of Jesus. He was shortly after, but still, he was relatively contemporary. That wouldn't have given time for the Jews to change their traditions so quickly. which means that Jesus was keeping the same reckoning that Josephus supposedly describes. Jesus went to the synagogues, he kept the Sabbath, he didn't say anything about their timing, their reckoning of the day. So therefore, Jesus endorsed their reckoning as the correct way to do things, and therefore the day begins at the evening. So you see how there's like therefore. So whenever you have that chain of therefores, you have to go to the original therefore and say like, is that correct? Because if the first thing is wrong, then everything else is wrong. Make sense? So the first thing is that Josephus is outright stating that the day begins in the evening. That's the claim. We have to examine that because maybe that's not true and therefore everything else is false. Does this claim that I just described to you, does it line up with everything we've looked at in Scripture? And all of the previous refutations, like I said in my chapter 4 of my Sabbath series, does it align with what the testimony of God's Word is? Well, the answer, of course, is no, it doesn't align at all. So that means there's something that we have to take a look at here because there's something deeper and more nuanced going on. Now, in the Bible, we have many situations where there is an overwhelming amount of evidence for something. And then something else in the Bible appears somewhere else, and it seems to be totally contradictory or even erroneous. Like, for example, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke. There's an error there because of translation. And I talk about that in various places. So whenever these kinds of inconsistencies happen, you have to remember that things get lost in translation quite a bit. Why? Because you're dealing with thousands of years of not only different languages, but different cultures and the way that people even reckon time, they thought about time, like the whole thing with 3 days and 3 nights and Jesus rising on the third day. Well, people who want to insist on a 72-hour reading do not understand that people back then counted inclusively, man. For somebody to say on the third day and after 3 days, that is an equivalent statement in the Israelite mind 2,000 years ago. Today, it's not an equivalent statement because those two things are two different periods. If you say on the third day, that's between 48 and 72 hours. If you say after 3 days, that's after 72 hours. So that's two different time periods. But people 2,000 years ago didn't think that way. So these kinds of cultural things compounding with the fact that you're dealing with a different language with different terms for things and words that we simply do not have in English because English is such a new language. It's a hodgepodge language. But something like Greek, which is so nuanced and so many tenses for things and so many little nuanced words for things that we don't even understand. Like some words you'll see today, some words we don't really understand even what they could mean. There's words that we don't know how to translate because they've been lost in translation. They're very nuanced understandings. So people reckoned time differently. They had idioms that they spoke of time with. They had inclusive counting. They had their languages that were very complex, like Greek and Hebrew, Aramaic, way more nuanced than English will ever be. So with all of that understanding, Josephus now uses various words to describe the time of the events that he's describing in this particular chapter. He uses two words, dielis and hespera, in his statement which describes the blowing of the trumpets. And both of these words are often, although not always, but often translated as evening. Most English translations also interpret his statements because of Jewish bias and the Jewish pollution of history with rabbinic traditions as the Sabbath had already started. So the English translators, because they are going off of Talmudic traditions and Masoretic traditions and rabbinic commentaries, assume that, what the Jews are doing now, which probably only came around in the medieval ages, they started inverting the days and celebrating the evening to evening reckoning. But what the Jews are doing now must be what Josephus was doing before. So when they read an ambiguous text in Greek, where there's certain words that are, you'll see, that are harder to translate, all of that bias gets imported in, and they translate it as Josephus stating that the day is beginning in the evening. And you have a translation now that aligns with Talmudic Judaism, but in fact is actually incorrect. And this is the problem, because they translate it as the Sabbath had already started, or at the start of the Sabbath day in the evening. That's how they translate it, but that's not what it's actually saying. So these two grammatical issues lead to the conclusion that Josephus is saying explicitly that the day starts with the evening, but this is not true, my friends. It's not true. So let's look at a couple of important things. Let's see. This is weekly Sabbath. No, this is not what I want. Okay, this is the Greek version of the Josephus writing in question. So this is Wars of the Jews, book 4, and let's just look for Sabbath. Here we go. Oops. There it is. Now I found the original Greek text of these writings. Of course, there's an English translation underneath, and I highlighted these words. See if I can zoom in for you. I highlighted these words. If I can find, okay, let's go back to the Sabbath. Here it is. I highlighted these words so you can see the correlation. You don't need to be a Greek speaker. I'm certainly not. But with technology and with research, we can discern the truth on these matters. Okay? There are certain words that are correlating to translation choices. Okay? There's hespera, which is here in, I don't know, magenta or purple. There's dielis, and there's epiouison. Epiouison. We'll get to this word because this is the word that is the problem word. So dielis relates to the blue, evening. Hespera relates to evening also, but they're actually two different words, you see? They're two different words, so obviously they're describing two different things. So are we sure that this is evening? Because this was translated as evening, and yet it's not actually evening. Dielis is, this is hespera actually. So hespera, which is the second word, if you look in the concordance, it definitely is evening. So the words, the situations where it would be used, for example, Luke 24, verse 29, but they constrained him, saying, abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them, which, by the way, also proves the day is reckoned for the morning. But Acts 4, verse 3, and they laid hands on them and put them in hold unto the next day, for it was now eventide. So hespera is used in these situations where very much clearly evening is being described. It's the feminine of adjective hesperos, evening, the eve being implied evening. So it's very clearly, the translation should be evening for this word. Okay, so if we go back to the Josephus translation, and again at the evening. So hespera is the second one, meaning it's the one that delineates when the second trumpet was blown. The first trumpet is blown in dielis, but the English translation here translated it as evening, but that's not entirely accurate. If we look up this word, dielis or delis is an ancient Greek noun and a typically ingenitive singular feminine form of adjective delos, which means timid, fearful, or cowardly. However, in ancient Greek texts, it also frequently appears as an inflected form of dele, a noun that translates to afternoon or latter part of the day, the most common meaning. Evening or dusk, hour or time of the day later in prose. In the genitive case, it acts as a time marker, meaning in the afternoon, in the course of the afternoon. It is notably used in the common poetic literary phrase, something something from the afternoon or from dusk, and as a temporary boundary in expressing things like from early morning until evening. So this is a much more nuanced word. Delis, deles. If I'm pronouncing that probably not correctly, but nevertheless it's spelled D-E-I-L-E-S would be the English way to spell it. Delius. So this word is much more nuanced. It doesn't clearly mean just evening. It could mean the afternoon. It's a general period that is a continuum between the afternoon and the evening. It's the latter part of the day after lunchtime all the way until the evening appears. So that period of time is much more appropriate for this. So it shouldn't have been translated to, if we go back now to this translation, it shouldn't have been translated to the evening. The blue word, deles or deles, should not have been translated to evening. It should have been translated to afternoon, or as the evening was approaching, which is the period before evening. Do you understand how this now starts to change the situation? Because now you've got two different words. You have two different words that are being used by Josephus. If he meant to say that the day was reckoned from the evening, then he would have used hespera for both words. He would have used hespera for both words to denote that, hey, when the evening actually came, that's when the trumpet blew because the day is beginning, and then the day ends again in the next evening, and that's when the second trumpet blew. But that's not what's being said here. What's being said is that the afternoon is when the first trumpet blows as the evening of that particular day approaches. And then when the evening comes the second time, it's being blown a second time to denote the end of this particular period. So this is something very different. Now, that means that he's not talking about the same day. He can't be. And this is where the third word, epioison, comes into play. So, epioison comes into play, let's see here, we're going to talk about in just a second. So hespera definitely means evening. Dailies is often used for the afternoon as the evening approaches, but the time is ambiguous and contextual, and it's not really used in scripture, that word, which is interesting that it's not really used. Dielos or delos is used for coward, but using the dielis as a word for the afternoon or as the evening was approaching, that is not really used in scripture. Again, the first problem is why. Why would Josephus make a difference between these two words? If the day is reckoned from an objective point, which is the evening, why would Josephus, who's extremely careful and meticulous, use two different words? Especially one that has a very long range of flexibility and is very ambiguous. One of these words is very clearly evening. The other word, which is the first trumpet, is a range of times from like after lunchtime all the way until the evening approaches. That's a very ambiguous way to word something if you are very concerned with transmitting when the day is starting. Do you understand? Like if Josephus' point in all this is to say like this is when the Jews were starting their day, then he's doing it in a very convoluted way. Of course, that's not what he's doing, but nevertheless, he's using two words. Now, epioison. Let's look about epioison. So the third word here that makes all of this come together and helps you understand how nuanced some of these issues are is this one, epioison. And if we read about it, epioison is the accusative singular feminine form of the present active participle of the Greek verb eisemi, which means to go into, to enter, or to come into. Broken down, the word means entering or she who is entering. Because it is an active participle, it describes an ongoing action. This is an important understanding, which again, none of this stuff, we don't have these kinds of nuances with time and things in our English vocabulary. We don't. But in Greek you do, and you have to be very cognizant of the words that they used. So this word, epioison, has the sense of describing an ongoing action that is happening. Okay? As a feminine noun or modifier, epioison is used when the person or thing is entering, is the direct object of a sentence. I saw the woman entering. So it is used as an ongoing, active, present participle of a situation. Okay, now let's read about this word because it's actually used in the New Testament with the Our Father. And the debate around what this word means is actually very interesting and revealing as to how Josephus meant to use that word in his writings on Wars of the Jews. So, epioison, that's spelled E-P-I-O-U-S-I-O-N. Epioison is Koine Greek adjective used in the Lord's Prayer. Give us today our epioison bread, right? So, because the word is used nowhere else, its meaning is unclear. So it's used one time, and it's used only in the Lord's Prayer. Very, very interesting. It is traditionally translated as daily, but most modern scholars reject that interpretation. The word is also referred to as epioisos, its presumed lemma form, or the reduced root word. Since it is a Koine Greek, tris legomenon, a word that occurs only thrice within a given corpus, found only in the New Testament passages like Matthew 6:11 and Luke 11 verse 3, and in the early Christian treatise, the Didache, but always in the same context of relaying the Lord's Prayer, its interpretation relies upon morphological analysis and context. The traditional and most common English translation is daily, although most scholars today reject this in part because all the other New Testament passages with the translation daily include the word hemera, day. Again, you're dealing with a language that is very specific with its use of times, a lot of nuanced vocabulary, so why did they use this word? Obviously, if they meant to say daily, and Jesus was saying daily bread, they would have used the word that they normally use, but they used a very special word. And the nature of this special word can give us a very interesting idea of what's actually happening in Josephus' writings, which will show you that the Sabbath is reckoned from the morning, not the evening. The Catechism of the Catholic Church holds that there are several ways of understanding epioison, including the traditional daily, but most literally as supersubstantial or superessential based on its morphological components. Alternative theories are that aside from the etymology of ousia, meaning substance, it may be derived from either the verb enai, meaning to be, or ienai, meaning both to come and to go. A majority of scholars today believe that epioison probably meant for tomorrow or for the future. So, of course, the Catholic Church is going to have its spin on it with supersubstantial. They're going to bring in transubstantiation, give us our transubstantiation and all this kind of stuff. You have to reject that. However, given the grammatical usage of this word as a word that describes something that is happening, that is coming in, and the context of this word, one very likely possibility is that it's actually saying, give us our bread for the day that is coming. Do you understand? Give us our day, give us our bread for the day that is coming. It's not give us our daily bread, which of course, that's fine to say that too, because it's biblical. But give us what Jesus was actually probably saying, given the fact that this word is uniquely used in this situation, is give us our bread for the day that is coming. And that has such profound implications. But let's keep reading. There's a little section here that I wanted to read somewhere. Let's see here. Oh, there was a section, dang it. Oh yeah, here we go. I didn't highlight it. I guess I thought I highlighted it, but not. So this is for the future. So this is arguments for this particular interpretation. A majority of scholars today believe that epioison meant for tomorrow or for the future. Early supporters of this translation include Cyril of Alexandria and Peter of Laodicea, by way of linking epioison with the word epiousa, meaning next or following. According to Jewish theologian Herbert Basser, this translation was also considered but eventually rejected as a possibility by Jerome, who noted it as an aside in his commentary to Matthew that the now lost Gospel of the Hebrews used mahar for tomorrow in this verse. So this lost manuscript, Gospel of the Hebrews, used the word mahar, which means for tomorrow, in this verse. So something was lost in translation with this particular verse. Raymond E. Brown claims it is also indicated by early Bohairic and Sahidic sources. Referencing epioisi in Acts 7 verse 26, the Lutheran theologian Albert Schweitzer reintroduced this translation in modern times. A, quote, for the future reading leads to a cluster of related translations, including bread for tomorrow, bread for the future, and bread for the coming day. This, I think, is the most likely. Bread for the coming day. And I'll explain that to you why I think that's the most plausible. Beyond the literal meaning, this translation can also be read in the eschatological context, the petition for an anticipation of the world to come. Others see tomorrow being referenced to the end times and to the bread of the Messianic feast. Raymond Brown argues that all of the other phrases of the Lord's Prayer are eschatological, so it would be incongruous for this phrase to be speaking prosaically about bread for eating. Edward Schweitzer, so really quick pause. What he's saying is, when you pray the Our Father, your kingdom come, your will be done. This is an eschatological prayer. It's a prayer really for the eternal state to come, for Jesus to return, to bring, life and to make all things right. So it's an eschatological prayer, meaning, give us today our daily bread, maybe misses the point of what was actually said. And it's actually that the bread statement is actually pointing you, like everything else, to the future kingdom, which is really interesting. Edward Schweitzer, a Swiss Protestant New Testament scholar and theologian, disagrees. Humble bread was not traditionally presented as part of a messianic feast, and the prosaic needs for bread to survive would have been a universal sentiment of Jesus' followers, which is also a good point. The Catholic theologian Brant Pitra acknowledges for the future interpretation is held by a majority of scholars, but criticizes it for lacking support among ancient Christian interpreters. Pitra also cites that an adjectival form for tomorrow exists in the ancient Greek in Matthew 6, verse 34, and could have been used instead of the one-time use of epioison. Another potential issue with a for the future translation is it seems to contradict Matthew 6:31, where only a few verses later Jesus tells his followers not to worry about food, that God will take care of such needs. W.D. Davies, a Welsh Congregationalist scholar, and Dale Allison, an American New Testament scholar, however, do not see a contradiction. Matthew 6, verse 34 tells one not to be anxious about such needs, that a pious person asks God in prayer for these needs to be filled may rather be why there is no need to worry. Yeah, there's no contradiction. So, what do we take from this? The Our Father situation is very interesting. It's a very interesting situation. It gives us a lot of context. The usual translation of daily is probably not accurate. It's probably not. Because Greek is extremely nuanced, and there's a word that's used there that is only used 3 times. It's only used in the Our Father, where they could have used the word for daily that they've used in other places in Greek, and they didn't. So something else is going on. Obviously, the Catholic interpretation we reject with the whole supersubstantial transubstantiation interpretation. But there's good evidence to believe that what Jesus was referring to is more profound, more sublime. Give us our bread for tomorrow, or for the day that is coming, for the day that is coming in. Remember how epioison means it's an active participle, meaning it's describing something that is happening, that is coming in. Give us the bread for the day that is coming in. It's just a profound statement, because it has relevance to the modern, or I should say relevance to the common time that they were in. Of course, people would recognize that they needed their bread and bread for tomorrow because they weren't sure what's going to happen tomorrow. So give us that bread that's coming for the day that is coming. But there's also, again, tying back to the kingdom, tying back to the typology of things like the Exodus and all these things that we've seen already. In the Exodus, the Sabbath that God provided for them with the manna, he provided for the 6th day and the day that was coming. So in the manna incidents in Exodus 16, God provided the manna for them on day 6, enough for also on day 7, which was the day that was coming. So that's an important point. So he gave them bread for 2 days, for both days. He gave them bread for the day of, and for the day that was coming, which was the Sabbath. Now, in that physical reality, which people were very attuned with, there is also a picture of the gospel and the eternal state. The Sabbath is a picture of eternity. I've talked about this many times. And God provides in this age and the age to come. That's the message being portrayed to you through a physical, situation in the Exodus. Likewise, Jesus gives us rest as Christians and provides for us in this age and also in the age to come. So in this statement that give us our bread for the day that is coming, there is a strong theme of the Sabbath, themes of the Exodus, rest, eternity, the coming kingdom. All of that is being wrapped up into the Our Father if we translated it more accurately. You see, when you say give us our daily bread, it's not wrong, because God does give you your daily bread, but that's not when you think of it that way, it puts your mind only on the here and now. Whereas what Jesus was saying, as usual, has multiple layers. It had a layer that was immediate. Give us our bread for the day that is coming, as in right now, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and so on. And give us our bread for the day that is coming, as in the day, the Sabbath day, the Sabbath rest, judgment day. Give us eternity. Give us eternal life. Do you see the correlation there? So now this statement is much more profound, and it's much more consistent with how Jesus speaks, because he's only speaking in multiple layers, and he's only speaking about the kingdom. So all of this works much better when we understand that the word epioison here in the Our Father is mistranslated. Now, take all of that we just talked about with the context of it meaning something that's coming in, it's an active coming in, it's an ongoing process, etc., etc. All of that we just talked about, import that now into the conversation with Josephus. Because Josephus uses the same word in his writings, and this word has been debated for the last 2,000 years. It's a very complex word. So, as usual, when it seems that there's a hard contradiction between history and the Bible, or even within the Bible itself, there's always more to the story, and usually, in my experience, there are translation problems, or misinterpretations, commentaries, this kind of things, that lose the original sense of the things that are being said. It's not that the original thing is wrong. It's that the interpretation and the translation through multiple layers and thousands of years has degraded the information that is conveyed to you. So you have to go back to the original and understand what was being said by the author. Josephus used two different words to refer to the trumpet blasts because he was describing something very practical and related to social circumstances, not cosmological time. I'm going to say this again. If we go back to this Greek translation here. So, deilis or dielis and hespera are two different words. Hespera is very clearly a word for evening. And that's used in the New Testament. It's very clearly used for the evening. Deilis, totally messing that up. Dielis, that word is used for a continuum in the latter half of the day. So these two words are very different. One is very succinct and closed, objective. One is a little more subjective. If you're trying to outline cosmological time, then this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense to use a subjective word and an objective word. But Josephus is not outlining cosmological time. And the way you know that is the word in between, which is epioison. Because this word is describing something that is entering, that is coming. And when you put all three together in understanding, you see exactly what he's describing. He's describing social circumstances of the day that was coming. The trumpet blast that was first was not when the Sabbath came in the evening. The trumpet blast that was first was during the day of preparation as the afternoon was winding down and the last final activities that you needed to do before the Sabbath came. The trumpet blasts were happening. And then, when the Sabbath was winding down and the evening finally came and the Sabbath, let me put it this way, because there's distinctions you got to make, folks, and if you don't make distinctions, it's very easy to think that you've just unwound something and now, oh my gosh, you've got the Holy Grail of truth. You have to make distinctions because you're dealing with such nuanced situations. The distinction in particular that you need to make is that there is a practical social layer and there is a cosmological layer. Okay? Josephus used two different words because he was describing a social and circumstantial situation, not the law of God or the cosmology of the time. Remember that the trumpet blasts for every Sabbath are prescribed nowhere in the Torah. Nowhere in the Old Testament did God ever say, every time the day begins, you need to blast trumpets. Nowhere is that commanded. This is a tradition and a cultural thing that came up and arose as a way to mark the underlying cosmological sequence and how that was layered with the social and practical issues of the time, like having a business, doing trade, running errands, all the things that people did. Okay, so this is a cultural tradition that came up at some point in time to make people aware of the cosmological reality that was coming. Okay? Hey, the day of preparation is winding down. You don't have too many hours left in the day. Because once it's evening, all the shops are closed, you're done. You got to go back to your private home and do your private preparations. So again, distinctions are the name of the day, or the word of the day. There are public things that you do, and there are private things that you do. Do you understand? Public versus private. When the daylight is out, You're doing public things that you need to get done publicly, doing transactions, going to court, doing various issues with businesses. If you own a business, moving things from to and fro, you're doing work, you're doing things that you do publicly. When the evening comes, you go back to your house and you're preparing your meal and everything. It's still the preparation day, but you're doing things that you would normally do only at home. The same thing is when the Sabbath finishes. You have public things that you do during the daylight. You go to synagogue, you maybe have a feast with your family, you go meet with friends, whatever people were doing at that time. They were doing public things that you could do when there was light. When the light was done, you went back into your homes, and now all of those public things are over. Doesn't mean the Sabbath is over. It means the public celebrations are over. That's why the second trumpet was in the evening of the Sabbath. These were not cosmological trumpets. These were social conveniences to get people's mind on the thing that is coming. The preparation day, when the trumpet was blasting, oh my gosh, we have a couple hours left. Before we go home and we prepare food. So their mind was there to know where they are in the sequence of time. Same thing with the Sabbath. The trumpet blasted, that was the end of the social part of the day, the circumstantially public part of the day, and now you're at home and doing resting activities at home and getting mentally ready for the week that is coming, and preparing yourself to start the week. So these are social conveniences. They're not cosmological timestamps. People like Mark, who argue that Josephus was making a doctrinal statement, are in error because he's not making a doctrinal statement. These trumpet blasts are not in the Torah, and Josephus is not commenting on cosmology. Josephus is documenting social and cultural practices that were practical. These practices are not commanded by God. They are traditions designed to help structure public life, because public life oriented around the daylight. And there were certain activities that you would do during the day, and there's certain activities that you would do at home at night. And the trumpets were there as a convenience to help people have in mind. There were a notification system. It's like you get a notification, when there's a storm or something, from public service announcement. It was a PSA. It was a public service announcement, and there were conveniences. Now, Josephus is describing, again, things that are patterns that are laid on top of the cosmological reality. These are social conveniences that were created. They weren't commanded, they were created, and they were layered on top of the cosmological reality, which was from sunrise to sunrise. But you didn't wait until sunrise to start thinking about the Sabbath. You started thinking about the Sabbath well before the Sabbath came. That's why you had the day of preparation. And also within the day of preparation, once the evening came, all the shops were closed, so you had to go back and home and prepare food. So there were certain ways that people divided their days up, and the trumpets were there as a convenience. You have the actual day when you have to not work, which is measured by morning. But then you have the work day and the social realities that were layered on top of that, which of course is from the daylight hours. But people weren't about to work during the evening. So when the evening trumpet blasted the second time, that's not like they went to go work or whatever else. No, they just went in their homes. They were done doing synagogue. They were done doing their feasting. They were resting in their homes and, mentally preparing for the work week. That's the purpose of the trumpets. They were just there as conveniences. So the trumpets address a social and practical reality. They do not indicate any cosmological reality. And the Greek of Josephus's writings proves that. The trumpet signal, therefore, is given in the afternoon or the twilight, the dielis, of the preparation day, as the Sabbath was coming in, so that people understood the week was coming to a close and, finish your preparations and, go home and prepare your food and everything else. So it's not if we go back to this translation, line 582 says, the last one was on top of the pastophoria where one of the priests used to stand and blow the trumpet. It says, in the evening at the start of every Sabbath. That's incorrect. That's not what he's saying. The Greek doesn't say that. The Greek says, blow the trumpet in the afternoon as the Sabbath was approaching. Well, what is he talking about? He's talking about the day of preparation. As the Sabbath was approaching, meaning the day of preparation was coming to an end and the Sabbath was coming in. The Sabbath was the highlight of the week. So get your stuff done. And then again, in the evening when that day was over, when the Sabbath day was over, meaning when the public celebration of the Sabbath was coming to an end and you were going in your homes, and now it's time to rest in your homes and think about basically the work week. So the wording here is incorrect in this English translation, and most English translations are not going to translate this correctly because of the Jewish bias in the commentaries and how that's clouded history, and also the mysterious nature of some of these words like epioison. But epioison doesn't mean when the start of every Sabbath. It says as the Sabbath was coming in. It's an active word describing a process that is ongoing. And the first word, dielis, is a word that describes a continuum in the afternoon. Well, you can't have, this is how you know this is not true, because you can't have a continuum delineate the beginning of the day. If Josephus is describing to you the beginning of the day in the evening, he should have used the word hespera, and he would have, but he's not. He uses a much more subjective word because these trumpets were not about delineating when the day begins. These trumpets were there as social conveniences. So they blew the first one in the early afternoon to remind you, hey, there's a couple left hours in the day, go take care of your business, and then get ready for the Sabbath and prepare your food. That's what's really going on here. So the day of preparation is when the first trumpet was blasted towards the end of the day of preparation as the Sabbath was coming in, because the Sabbath is coming in and people getting ready for the Sabbath. That doesn't mean the day begins in the evening. It just means the Sabbath was coming in because the last public transaction that you can do is in the evening, right? Businesses close, people go home. So that's it. Meaning if you don't get anything done by 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. or whatever it was, then you're screwed. The Sabbath is coming in. That's the next thing, and you can't do anything on the Sabbath. So this is how people thought. Again, we don't really have a concept for that because we live in a 24/7 life, but it's very different 2,000 years ago. So the trumpet was blasted again in the evening of the Sabbath because they had the daylight portion of the public celebrations come to an end, not because the Sabbath was coming to an end. People did not work at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. or whatever. They just went home and they rested and they did their thing at home. The private celebration was continuing, but the public celebration was over. So these trumpets are a public notification system for public activities. They're not cosmological trumpets. These people were, quote unquote, getting ahead of the cosmological reality with the trumpets so that people could mentally prepare, both to enter the Sabbath and to exit the Sabbath. So of course you're going to have a pattern that is offset from the actual cosmological pattern in order to help you prepare in both ways, prepare to enter the Sabbath and prepare to exit it. It's a mental convenience. And this is actually consistent with yet another area that I've discussed many times, which of course Mark brought up in his challenge, which is Nehemiah 13. So if we go to Nehemiah 13, of course you know this story. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. So people read this and believe that, okay, as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, meaning once it got dark, the Sabbath began. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying at all. It just says, as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath. Yeah, the Sabbath is in the morning on Saturday, and it gets dark before that. That's an accurate statement. So what's going on here? Well, people always think this is solid proof that the day begins with the evening, but it's not. It's preposterous. Nehemiah was dealing with people who were trading and setting up their booths early in the morning, like probably 4 a.m, so that they could get ahead of the sunrise. So that when the sunrise came and people started their day, the booths were already set up. I got my wares. What do you want? This kind of stuff, right? Again, people's lives depended on trading and using the sunlight to the maximum. You have to remember this because it's not the way that we think. So they had to be ready by the morning and, have all their wares out and about, which took a lot of time. So they were coming very early, probably like 3 a.m, maybe even earlier, to set up a shop. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these like bazaars or whatever, if you ever had a booth, it takes a lot of work to set up a booth, especially if you have like trinkets and jewelry and food and all this stuff. It takes hours, to travel there to set up your tent and everything else. So people were getting there, very early. So when do you think is the most logical time to prevent them from doing that? You think waking up at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, and shooing them away is the right thing to do? Or is waiting until the day of preparation is over, to the daylight is over on day 6, and the evening comes, they have to pack up their stuff, they're going to go home, and then close the gate. That way, even if they come at like 2 a.m, 3 a.m, the gate's closed. Sorry, can't do anything. That's the most logical interpretation. So Nehemiah is not saying that the Sabbath begins in the evening. Nehemiah is actually being extremely practical and getting ahead of them by having the gates closed at the end of the working day on the preparation day, on day 6. And he's being very practical and choosing the earliest possible time, which was the evening. Not because the day begins in the evening, but that's the earliest possible time that he could do this. And also without working on the Sabbath. Because again, if the Sabbath begins in the morning, which it does, he's not going to command them to work in the morning and close the gates. Same thing with this. If the Sabbath began in the evening, then closing the gates in the evening would be working and carrying a burden. They're not, are you kidding me? The Jews who had like an entire day as a buffer to prepare for the Sabbath and were constantly thinking about the Sabbath because working on the Sabbath was like considered blasphemy and you're going to infuriate God and get destroyed, like we see in so many examples in the Old Testament. So they are so cautious not to work on the Sabbath. Think about this clearly, friends. You're dealing with people who are extremely cautious to not work on the Sabbath. So they had an entire day that they were watching to getting everything prepared so that they don't do anything on the Sabbath. Because of all the instances where God was furious about people working on the Sabbath. Okay, so you're dealing with that. You're going to tell me that Nehemiah believed that the day was ending at the evening, and right when it got dark, when the day had practically already begun, he's going to have his guards close the gates and perform work on that day? Are you kidding me? No way. That's way too dangerous for them. They would never do such a thing. Rather, they would get ahead of the Sabbath, close the gates in the evening on the end of the preparation day so that when the morning came, everything was done and everything was set. Make sense? So the evening error is twice refuted in this verse, because if it was the evening, then they were breaking the Sabbath by having his servants being stationed and basically doing all this work and closing the gates, having some servants, stationed there. This is all work. That would be breaking the Sabbath. Point number 2 is that it doesn't say the Sabbath begins in the evening. It just says they close the gates in the evening before the Sabbath. Very practical approach. If people were coming at 2 or 3 in the morning, close it at 6 p.m., 7 p.m. That way you get ahead of them. And no matter how early they come, they're not going to find the gate open. So it was a preventative measure on the preparation day. And that is completely consistent with what Josephus is reporting to you. 100% consistent. Because the trumpet practices that Josephus is reporting to you are not cosmological realities. They are practical realities where people are getting ahead of the Sabbath. And then on the Sabbath, they're getting mentally prepared because now they're in their homes in the evening. It's time to wind down, get ready mentally for the work week, that kind of thing. So these are mental conveniences that are social and practical, just like Nehemiah is getting ahead of the Sabbath by closing the gate on the evening of the preparation day. Same thing, literally the same thing. There's no inconsistency. But when you want to insist that the day begins in the evening, you have to equivocate constantly and redefine what Josephus is saying, even though he's using specific words that do not mean what the English translations are telling you they mean. So people don't read in context and they don't consider the impact of their beliefs. And as usual, they get suckered easily into these things, which are just traditions of men. Hopefully you're learning something. Hopefully you're learning to pay attention and to go deeper into word studies when there's a contradiction that is very serious, to understand what's going on so that you can resolve the contradiction, because God's word will be proven true. Josephus is a great historian, but history has always proven the Bible correctly. History does not contradict the Bible. So if Josephus lived around the time of Jesus and he And the claim is that Josephus is reporting that the Jews were keeping the day from evening to evening, and that contradicts everything in Scripture, then something is not right. Either Josephus made an error, but that's unlikely because he's very meticulous, very detailed. Or there's a translation issue. Well, that's probably what it is. And lo and behold, that's exactly what it is. Now, the next part of this also relies on Josephus, but as we clearly saw, Josephus is not in alignment with the evening Sabbath keepers. He's reporting to you something very plain, which is just a social reality, and so he's in alignment with the morning Sabbath keepers. But nevertheless, let's read. Number 4. Again, Josephus preserves Roman edicts granting concessions for Jews to keep the Sabbath. In his work called Antiquities 16, book 16-1.63, he writes, "They shall not be obliged to appear before a judge on the Sabbath day, nor on the day of preparation before it, after the 9th hour." This matters because the 9th hour is about 3 p.m. Roman authorities recognized that Sabbath restrictions effectively began before sunset. Thus, Jews were exempted from appearing in court or before a judge after 3 p.m. on Friday to enable them to prepare for the approaching sundown Sabbath. This aligns exactly with Friday afternoon preparation for a Sabbath beginning at sundown. This only makes sense if the Sabbath begins Friday evening, not Saturday morning, and Jews were already considered Sabbath restricted before nightfall. No, it does not. This is wrong. So this is again where Mark equivocates and assumes his conclusion is true and builds an entire set of arguments very convincingly, but not that convincing for me. But nevertheless, they're not right. Mark, you're equivocating on the belief that the end of the practical work week means also the end of the cosmological work week. You assume that just because the public social transaction time is coming to an end when the sun goes down, which, of course, that also means the day is coming to an end. But that's not true. That's not true at all. Again, you're conflating social and practical realities with cosmological realities. And you assume, therefore, that because of this edict, that the day must begin in the evening. But that's not at all the case. That assumption is not required whatsoever. It's just another example of being relatively confused on what's going on and not being detail-oriented enough and not reading in context, really. Josephus was describing that the Jews were allowed an exemption from not appearing in court on Fridays any later than 3 p.m. Of course, they didn't call it Friday, but, the preparation day, or the Sabbath, for religious reasons. And of course, that makes sense. Now, the assumption that Mark is saying is that this is because the day was beginning at evening, so they needed the time to prepare for the evening Sabbath. This is partly true. They did have that exemption because they needed the time to prepare. That's true. But you're conflating social and cosmological realities, and these need to be distinguished. Ancient life revolved around the sun, around daylight, because they didn't have street lamps. Today, you can go to Walmart at any time you want. You can go at 1 a.m. to Walmart, if it's a 24/7 Walmart, and go grocery shopping or do whatever you want. I mean, that's just absurd in human history. For most of human history, that was not the case. And of course, that's not how life was 2,000 years ago. Once the sun went down, nobody was doing any business with you. They were going home, they were preparing their food, they were eating their final dinner, whatever they were doing. They were just going home. If you needed something for the Sabbath and you forgot to prepare it by the evening, you were screwed. You were screwed because nobody was going to do business with you anymore. They had their own stuff they had to do. They had to go home, prepare their food, tuck their kids in, whatever. They had their stuff that they needed to do. So yes, they needed to prepare. That's why they asked for the exemption. A Jew is not going to go waste their time in some pagan Gentile court and mess up their Sabbath timing. They're not going to do that. But that's not because the day was beginning in the evening, my friends. That's because the social and public life and the time that was available for social transactions was coming to an end at 6 or 7 p.m. So they needed those hours to be blocked off so that they could take care of public business, not because the day was coming to an end. In other words, the Sabbath was beginning in the evening. That's not at all the case. And that's a huge distinction. That's a huge distinction. One is a cultural and practical reality, and the other is a cosmological reality. The edict is not saying the Sabbath begins Friday evening, therefore the Jews are already Sabbath restricted after 3 p.m. It doesn't say that. It's just saying, don't drag the Jews into legal obligations late on the preparation day because they need the remaining daylight to prepare for the Sabbath that is coming. That's what it's actually saying. They need the remaining daylight to prepare for the Sabbath that is coming because nobody does business in the evening. People had both a public, again, this distinction is a very important one for this particular conversation because these arguments are very well structured. They're wrong. They're based on equivocations and flawed assumptions, but they're very well presented. So you have to make distinctions. Otherwise, you're going to get lost. One distinction that Mark needs to make, and I hope that he makes it after this episode, is between public and private situations. Preparation is not just general preparation. There were public preparations that you did. You went and did transactions. You got food. You managed your business. You did legal things. You did things in society. But is that all of the preparation that people did? Think about this clearly, friends. Is that everything that people did? No, they had private preparations. Their clothing, their food, their children. They had all of these things that they needed to do in their private homes. When do you think they would do those things? Do you think they're going to use their precious daylight hours on all those things? Or do you think they're going to do their public things and then go back home and do, of course, some women had businesses, but by and large, women stayed at home and did some of those things. But men also had things that they needed to do when they came home. There were private preparations. So when do you think they're going to do those things? They're going to do them in the evening. Do you really think that if the sun went down at 6 p.m., let's say 7, let's be really merciful here and be 7, very conservative. So you have 4 hours. Do you think once they got home at 7 p.m., after being busy for the entire week and preparing, that there was nothing more to prepare? Do you think that they didn't have any food preparation or preparing whatever else they needed to prepare for their homes to be ready for the Sabbath? They didn't have any of that? Of course they did. Do you think 4 hours was enough of daylight? No, daylight was being used on other things, on public things. So they were doing work well into the night and preparing for the Sabbath. So that means that they were working still even when they got home in the evening. So it's not because the Sabbath was beginning in the evening. It's because the time that they had to do public things was coming to an end. And that was very valuable time. That was very valuable time to somebody 2,000 years ago. And of course, we don't understand that these days. But once the evening came, they had other things to do. And that's a very important distinction. So this is the same issue as before with the trumpet blasts. The exemption cutoff at 3 p.m. was not because the Sabbath was beginning at the evening. It was a cultural reality that acknowledged practical situations, which is the need to do things publicly during the daylight hours. The trumpet blasts weren't delineating cosmological time. They were putting cultural attention and mindset into a practical sequence so that people could be aware of what time it was, get a notification, and be mentally aligning themselves towards the Sabbath and exiting the Sabbath. The same thing as with the prohibition on court appearances with the 3 p.m. cutoff. That was not because the cosmological day begins in the evening. Are you kidding me? That's because the time for doing public things is very precious, and there's only so much of it that you basically have. And so the cutoff was 3 p.m. because they needed that daylight hours to do those things, not to waste them in court with Gentiles. So think of it this way. Here's a simple example. Okay. A preparation cutoff before the Sabbath does not define the Sabbath starting point any more than closing a store at 5 p.m. defines Christmas beginning at 5 p.m. The assumption that Mark makes, which is a flawed assumption, is that there is a cutoff at 3 p.m. and therefore the Sabbath was beginning in the evening. It doesn't say that. Why is the cutoff at 3 p.m.? Because the Sabbath was beginning in the evening? No. Because the daylight hours were running out and they needed the time to do public transactions. If stores on Christmas Day close at 5 p.m. or at 3 p.m., that doesn't mean that Christmas begins at 8 p.m. or that Christmas begins at 5 p.m. Those do not determine when Christmas begins. The reckoning of the day begins Christmas. And of course, in the Babylonian system we live in, the reckoning of the day begins with midnight, the darkest hour. It's an inversion of the truth. But nevertheless, the point is, it's the reckoning of the day that determines when the day begins, not the social realities of when stores close or edicts or whatever else. Those have nothing to do with it. We don't say that Christmas begins when stores close, because the day is reckoned independently of the social and economic realities. The same thing is with this. The trumpet blasts, the Roman edict to be exempt from court, these things are social and practical realities. And Mark is conflating them into one reality, cosmological reality, and saying they're the same thing. They're not. You're dealing with a very complicated and nuanced situation that is lost and buried under thousands of years of, history and, of course, deception, never mind you with all of the Jewish commentary and rabbinic traditions that have polluted all these things. Now, one more part with this. This is part 5, and it's the last part, and it mentions archaeology as proof that Josephus supposedly is reckoning from evening to evening. However, at this point, the argument completely falls apart. So let's read. There are so many things to go into this already, but this post is already too long. My final point here would be evidence from archaeology. The trumpeting place inscription corroborates Josephus' account and marks the place where the priest stood to announce the arrival and the ending of the Sabbath. The trumpeting place inscription is one of the most important archaeological pieces of evidence related to Josephus' description of the Sabbath announcements. In 1968, archaeologists digging near the southwest corner of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem discovered a large stone block bearing a partially preserved Hebrew inscription, quote, to the place of trumpeting for announcing, or to the trumpeting place for proclamation. Many scholars conclude that this tablet tallies with Josephus' account, since he mentions a specific place where a priest stood and blew a trumpet in the quote I have already shared above. Evidence from archaeology carries a lot of weight. This tablet is a clear proof of what used to happen in the first century. Those who want to read more about this can access it on Wikipedia and several other online sources. Just Google the trumpeting place inscription. I believe no single human or denomination has every doctrine right. This is simply because we are human and never perfect. Only God is perfect and knows all truth. I agree with that. That's why you need to base your beliefs on what God has said, which you are not doing, my friend. And so hopefully you have been able to watch my presentation and see that your arguments are based on flawed assumptions. Now, Mark brings up this trumpeting place inscription, which is an interesting discovery, and it does confirm what Josephus was talking about. So Josephus was being very meticulous as usual, so we can trust what he said. However, there's an assumption that Mark makes, and the assumption is that Josephus is describing cosmological realities. The stone was discovered, and the question is this: what does that have to do with when the day starts? Crickets. It doesn't have anything to do with when the day starts. It's just a stone commemorating a cultural practice that was being done. And yes, it corroborates Josephus' account, but Josephus isn't making a cosmological statement as we previously established. So this is a serious problem for your argument, and it just shows that this is a series of erroneous conclusions that are built on top of each other. You're assuming that Josephus is talking about a cosmological reality, and then you find an archaeological piece of evidence that supports what Josephus is saying, but in fact, Josephus isn't saying what you think he's saying, and therefore, the archaeological piece only reinforces my position, not yours. So there's that. The archaeological proof doesn't do anything for the argument that the Sabbath begins in the evening. The inscription says nothing about the time of day that they were doing anything. It just says they were blowing trumpets. Josephus tells you when that was, and we looked at the Greek of that and how that has a very specific timing that was very circumstantial to the cultural realities of the time with the preparation day and being mentally prepared for both coming in and out of the Sabbath. So that's true, but Josephus is not defining when the day begins. He's documenting a cultural convenience. And the stone that they discovered, the trumpeting place inscription, that's documenting that, yes, this was actually something that people did. It's a cultural convenience. It's not saying the Lord said that the day begins in the evening. From evening to evening is the seventh day. It doesn't say that. God defines when the day begins and ends. And God has clearly defined that the day begins with the morning, with the greater light. With light. What do you expect? God is light. So I hope all of this was useful, my friends. I hope you learned something important. Hopefully, Mark and many like him will realize their error, and also that sometimes you can be too smart for your own good, because obviously Mark is very intelligent and he put together his arguments very well. However, it's important to research and go deep and resolve contradictions with word studies, sometimes if you need to, with history, and be very clear about what you're believing, because the Bible does not contradict itself, and history does not contradict the Bible. So we always know that for sure, and you have to test everything. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence in Scripture that the day begins with the morning. If you want that evidence, go to my Sabbath series, episode number 4. So if someone or something completely contradicts that fact, then you have to question your assumptions. You have to question the translation. You have to question, because we know that God's word is true. Mark did not question his assumptions, and as a result, he compounded error after error after error, because he just keeps assuming his conclusion is true and building that into the text, when in fact the text proves otherwise. However, Mark's arguments are very convincing on face value, so if you weren't aware, then these things might skew you towards the evening Sabbath, and of course the evening Sabbath is a gateway into religion and tradition and philosophy. So you always have to test everything, and you have to divide rightly and create distinctions. Again, there is, in this conversation, the distinction between the cosmological reality that was set by God in the very beginning in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And then there are practical and circumstantial and typological realities that are set later, much later, like cultural traditions of trumpets blowing on the preparation day, or the court exemptions, the appointed feasts with various times and endings tying back to the Exodus. All of these are subjective in the sense, not that they're subjective like relativistic, but they have a unique reckoning because they are circumstantial. Okay? They're circumstantial. They're not laid down by God as universal patterns for all of humanity. One is cosmological, and it governs the structure of time itself. And by the way, it's also a moral command. The other is clearly distinguished as very different and circumstantial and typological and cultural, etc., etc., etc. These are two completely different realities, my friends. And when you conflate the two because it just sounds better in your mind, or you think that's the way it should go, you're going towards deception. These are all relative, contextual situations, not cosmological and objective situations, like the seventh day starting in the morning, because the day is reckoned with the greater light. And unfortunately, people confuse these things often, and they result in getting indoctrinated by tradition, by philosophy. And then pretty soon you're a Hebrew roots legalist, and you're keeping the feasts and all these other things. So don't do that. Remember also that you have the pollution of knowledge by the rabbinic system, rabbinic Judaism, the Masoretic text, the Masoretic alphabet, all sorts of translation errors, AI training errors. AI is trained on, you got to be careful with Google. And, Gemini is usually pretty good. I've found that if you challenge Gemini and you really state your case plainly, it starts to break free from its programming, at least for the time being. But AI is trained on rabbinic Judaism. Okay, so when you talk with like ChatGPT or Gemini about the day beginning in the evening, it's going to reinforce that pattern because it's trained on rabbinic Judaism. And rabbinic Judaism developed that practice long after Jesus. The Jews of Jesus' time, even though they were legalistic, like the Pharisees, they were still keeping the day from morning to morning. That inversion came much later. And of course, rabbinic Judaism is a counterfeit, and it tries to backdate itself back to the Old Testament. So it's going to convince you that, no, the Jews always did this. The Jews always did this, which of course is not true. The scriptures are very clear that God reckons the day with the greater light, because he begins everything with light and life, not darkness and death. God is light, and we are not children of darkness. We are children of the light. Ephesians 5, verse 8 through 10. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 5. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. And 1 John 1, verse 1 through 5. This is the 1 John 1, verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. It's the children of darkness that invert everything that God does, my friends. And this whole teaching that the day begins with the evening is an inversion of the truth. So it's all pretty straightforward. And like I said at the very beginning, common sense is not that common, unfortunately, but hopefully it's a little more common to you today. I hope that this has been edifying. I hope that you share what you learned with your friends. And I hope that you take care and do not wander into legalism. We'll see you next time. Take care and God bless.